In what's going to be the longest of these videos, we're going to think now about the spectacle of this period, the physical conditions, and in particular we want to think about the emergence of the British playhouse. A reminder that during the medieval period there were no playhouses. Plays were put on outdoors on those moving platforms that moved around the city. And once those religious plays were banned, the idea of setting up something like a moving platform still stayed as the first step in development. But the problem became for professional playwrights, professional actors, during the period of the British Renaissance, that they needed to be paid for their work, and in order to be paid for their work, they had to find some way to control the crowd. In the medieval period, it was part of a civic celebration, and the professionals were either paid by their guild to put it on, or did their work voluntarily. They were not, in effect, passing the hat. But professionals in the Renaissance period had to find a way to control the crowd so they could charge them. And it turned out that the way they did that was go into inns. Now, something like a modern hotel. But inns in this period were built around a courtyard model, in a way that many hotels are now built around a swimming pool in modern times, where there's a big square building with doors that can be locked to the outside, but then there's an inner courtyard. During Shakespeare's time, almost all of these inns had stables on their first floor, and the rooms were on the second floor, so they all had balconies. Sometimes they went on up to a third floor, which also had balconies that looked out over this. So if you really want to think about this, just think about your knowledge of contemporary hotels, and think about what it would be like if instead of a swimming pool in that inner courtyard, there was a big flat playing area where a temporary stage could be set up. And here's an example of what that stage would have looked like. Now, of course, what's going on here is that a company is coming into town, they're going into one of these inn yards, then they are capable of locking the doors to the outside and charging people admission, letting them come in one at a time after they've paid admission to see the play. So that was the start of the manner of professional theater in this time period. You can see that the platform that's set up in the middle of the auditorium there, as it were, is a version of one of those traveling wagons from the medieval period, raising the actors up above the level of the crowd. So here we see the leftover influence of the medieval theater, but the subject matter has now changed. The next stage, starting in the 1570s, was to actually build some buildings only in London, it's the only place it took place, that resembled the shape of those inn yards, but were for the sole purpose of putting on plays or sporting events. So they took that model, that kind of square building built around a courtyard, and expanded on the idea. Many of these buildings actually turned out to be polygons, that is, they made them look more round, gave better sight lines than those kinds of square buildings. But now, instead of having rooms taking up a lot of the space, they have just these balconies so they can get lots more audience members in here. These theaters are not huge, but they still would seat about 3,000 people. Seating is the wrong word, because right there in front of the stage during that courtyard, people actually stood during the entire performance. But altogether, about 3,000 people could see a play in the Globe Theatre, which we'll look at it a little more once we get a little further down the development. But here you see the same basic idea. It's just a temporary platform set up into the middle of this amphitheater with this purpose-built building around it. But if you look at that, let's let's go back here for 1 second. If you look at this space, you'll realize that the rooms directly behind it, the spaces directly behind the kind of leftover skinny building in the back, that tent that sticks up at the back of the stage, is blocking the sight lines. So there really isn't any way to put people back there to watch the play. So the next stage in development was, oh yes, well why don't we just sink that into the building? Why don't we actually make that part of the building the backstage area? It was called the tiring house during this period, as in attiring, putting on one's attire. We would call it the dressing rooms now. But we just push it back in so it actually is flush with the face of the building there, but we still have the courtyard surrounding it, the balconies going all the way around it, and essentially we still have a trestle stage sticking out into the audience. Here's a more elaborate development, but it's still the same idea. It's still got the tiring house backing up into the main playhouse. It has backstage area still, but the tiring house itself, the facade, is becoming much more elaborate. You'll notice that it's now 3 stories instead of 2 stories. It has this playing space underneath where we can let people come on from behind a curtain, or maybe reveal a scene or two if we want to have a bed, something like that. On top of that is a balcony, the kind of balcony where Juliet's balcony scene would have been played. And yet on top of that, we now see a 3rd level. And that's a room where the musicians sat to play, because of course performances were accompanied live in this period. There is no such thing as recorded music yet. So by the time we get to the 2nd Globe Theater, Shakespeare's first Globe, Shakespeare's company's first theater, named the Globe, burned to the ground in 1613, and in 1614 they rebuilt it on a plan that looked something like this. Now you can see that the stage is covered over with a roof that sticks out into the courtyard and covers about half of the total space, protects the actors from the wind and the rain, not necessarily the audience that are still standing out in the open. But the entire space is covered over, and up there above is something like a modern fly loft. They didn't have elaborate scenery yet, and they weren't flying full flats in and out, but actors were raised and lowered from that area above the stage. Another view of the same thing, proposing that it was just a simpler looking plan than the one that we just looked at. So, the most familiar of the theaters in this period is the Globe Theater, and I just want to look in a little more detail about the first Globe, the one that eventually burned down. But here's a view of what that playhouse must have looked like. This is a conjectural reconstruction, but you can see the stage there. To our surprise, that little roof that sticks out over the top of it is supported by pillars that just stand right there in the middle of the stage. You can see that the stage has trap doors in it, and that underneath there's the stage has been raised to the level where the actors are sticking up above the heads of the audience, but that also allows for a trap room underneath. You can see in this reconstruction some ideas about what the backstage area would have looked like, and we're seeing it cut away. So on the far side there, we're looking at audience areas, somebody standing in the pit, and then in that labels, those areas labeled D and F, you can see areas where patrons could actually sit down and see over the heads of the spectators in front of them. They had to pay more money to do that, to get these better seats. And they also could be seen better in those locations. So wealthy people often paid not just to see the play, but to be seen at the play. Here's the same theater, but in cross-section from the middle, so we're looking at the stage straight on right now, not looking into the backstage areas, but you get a chance to see what the seating areas look like around the outer edges. The height of the audience standing there in the pit, an actor on stage, and then a couple up there in the balcony above that you can see acting out on that space. Yet another drawing, a different artist trying to reconstruct it, giving an idea of what it might look like. This is an artist who thinks it was much simpler than the other two artists, much less elaborately developed. And so his plan is appropriately kind of scaled down. You'll see that the pillars are much less prominent. The stage is smaller. He thinks it all looked a little less elaborate than the other two. But here's a full view of what it would have looked like from the outside. If we're, kind of peeking in, you can see the audience seating area, but it was a fully circular building with that stage kind of stuck into one part of the building and then this circular courtyard surrounding it. The Globe, of course, was not the only playhouse in this period. There were several others that, as soon as the Globe became profitable, or the theater actually became profitable, some other playhouses were built. Here's just a few of them to get a quick overview. This is the Swan, the only theater from this period of which we have an actual drawing dating from the time period. So a lot of the information about what we think playhouses looked like in this period come from this, what we call the DeWitt sketch of the Swan. But this is a reconstruction of how the Swan Theater must have looked. The Fortune Theater, which was built after the Globe and was meant as a commercial rival to the Globe, and we are told, we have the contract for the building of it, and we're told that it's supposed to be the same size as the Globe, only square instead of circular. So here's another view of the Fortune, more elaborate view of it here. You get an idea that it looks very similar to the Globe, but in this case it's solid square, which makes the courtyard smaller. That is, the stage takes up more of the space of the courtyard. There's not as much space to get around it and look at it from the sides. There in just a little bit closer view, you see those entranceways on either side. Those would have been the path that the audience came in and out. It's the equivalent of the Greek parados. And you can also see that the Fortune was a three-story building, 3 layers of audience on the sides. The Hope Theater used a little different plan, a cantilevered roof to stick out over the audience, or over the stage, so that there weren't pillars in the audience's way. You can see that it has that odd point that sticks way up there on the top, but that had to be built there to counterbalance that stage roof that you see sticking out over the stage. Get a little closer view of it there. And the Rose Theater. We've recently found the archaeological remains of the Rose Theater in London, so we know more about this theater than almost any other. And these remains have told us a lot of things, and sometimes some very surprising things. But we also know that the Rose was eventually abandoned because it was too small. The demand for it, for the plays, was much greater than they could house, even when they crammed the crowd in there fully. And it became problematic for the theater company because they were walking away from money every day. But as a space, it's a very interesting space, and quite near the site of those archaeological remains, a modern reconstruction has been built, and this is what the modern-day Rose Theater looks like, with the stage sticking out there into the audience, and then a square a round pit, excuse me, in front of it, and 3 layers of seating. There's also been a reconstruction of the Globe Theatre built on the bank side. A lot of people think this is the original. It's not. The original was burnt down somewhere about 1642. And we don't know that this is in fact how it looked, but it's the best we can do in a modern reconstruction. It's a fascinating place to visit if you ever get to London. Let's just take a quick look and we can see, this is with a fisheye lens, but you can see what it looks like. The circular globe, the stage there, the roof up over the top of it, and the audience standing in the courtyard to watch the performance. Notice people on the front are actually leaning their elbows on the stage, supporting themselves clear down there in the front. It is used for evening performances, which was not authentic to Shakespeare's time because, of course, they didn't have electric lighting. They were dependent on the sun. But the modern theater has accommodated evening performances by putting some lights in it. So this is from the backstage angle. You can see a full crowd there. Again, the stage sticking out into the audience and the crowd standing. A daylight performance. The elaborate pillars that hold up the stage here, painted to look like faux marble, and the crowd down front. And this gives you some sense, if you're down in that pit, standing, you can look up into the top of that stage roof, the area called the heavens. Right in the middle of that you see a very brightly colored square because an actor can be lowered from there. In fact, a god is about to make an entrance from that height, so the light is already shining through something like the trap in the ceiling through which the god will be lowered down onto the stage on some kind of pulley. And you get some sense, again, fisheye lens, so everything is a little bit distorted, but you get some sense of the crowd looming up above you.